guys who are now in office, recycled Reaganites mostly, they understand that very well. That's the way they kept the country under control in the 80s by one or another. The Libyans are coming, the Sandinistas are coming, on, and it frightened people. And people are genuinely frightened. So when George Bush says if we don't stop him today, he's going to come after us tomorrow with weapons of mass destruction, it scares people. I mean, very honest, serious people stand up at meetings and very heartfelt comments saying, yeah, I'm anti-war and I don't like this, but he's going to come after us and there'll be a mushroom cloud. And in fact, if you look around the world, you'll notice that the only people afraid of Saddam Hussein are people from the United States. People in the region aren't afraid of him. Europeans aren't afraid of him. I don't know about Canada. I don't follow that closely. But in the United States, there's real fear. And that's the way you control people. If you want to divert the attention of the population from an assault that you're carrying out against them, frighten them. I mean, it's an old story. And it's used by, I mean, it's second nature to everybody. And yes, in fact, they're these are guys who are mostly from the Reagan administration, and they did exactly the same thing then. So 20 years ago, they came in, Reagan administration did it. They're following the same script. First, drive the country into a deep deficit from a budget surplus, the government from surplus to deficit. That means you have to you have to cut back social spending, which is very important. It was done by actually it's described in the Wall Street Journal front page this morning. I mean, they don't put it quite in the terms that I'm going to use, but they basically describe it. They point out that the Bush administration, of course, drove the country into a big deficit by things are happening independently, but their own decisions were two. One was a tax cut, which in fact is for the rich. The Wall Street Journal don't say that. So 40% of it is top 1% of the population. So a big tax cut for the rich, and the biggest increase in the in federal government spending for 20 years. That is since the Reagan administration, because these guys are believers in big government. They're not conservatives. They're reactionary, statist extremists. They want a very big government, but for the rich. So the biggest federal spending in 20 years, and a big tax cut for the rich. So of course you get a deficit, and then you can cap, social spending, and you can move on to eliminating the public education system and the limited medical support system that exists in the United States. You got to get rid of that, cut back pensions and so on. But you don't want people to think about this. What you want is for them to be terrified. So 20 years ago, in fact, just 20 years ago, another bold cowboy was in the White House, surrounded by tanks, because there were hitmen, Libyan hitmen, roaming the streets of Washington. Were going to assassinate our leader. And everybody was trembling in fear and admiring the courage of the John Wayne up there. And it went on like that right through the 1980s. The Sandinistas were 2 days' march from Texas, and Gaddafi was going to expel us from the world, and Hispanic narco-traffickers are going to destroy our youth, and so on and so forth. And the population was terrified, and you could carry out the assault. So they're doing the same thing, same script. So that's where Iraq comes in. Yeah, and you got to have another monster who's going to. In fact, you read George Bush. If we don't get to him now, he's going to be dropping nuclear bombs on us tomorrow. Not like a year from now, but tomorrow it's going to attack us right away. And people are afraid. I give talks to. I haven't seen an audience of less than a couple of thousand people for quite a while. But when people ask questions, some of them are. It's very genuine. They're genuinely afraid. They say, look, if we don't stop him now, he's going to come after us. And if it isn't him, it's going to be Noriega or some other monster Gaddafi or whoever comes along. Next, it's going to be Iran. If we don't stop them now, they're going to come after us. And that's the way you frighten people.
I want to ask you about the mobilization of fear, and you've talked a lot about it as mobilization of fear of those from without. But one of the things that I guess I would ask you is, the way in which mobilization of fear from within can be actually damaging to organizing in terms of fear of one's neighbor, fear of the people who live in your community, and there's ways in which Canada too has been caught in that mobilization, so it's not just fear of being invaded by Saddam Hussein, which in some ways is easier to address than it is to be immobilized by fear that the person you knew is somehow, and it strikes me that that's an element of fear that I'd be interested in you commenting on and what impact that's had in America, because I think that's something which at least I'm very conscious of in reading the news on an ongoing basis, and it strikes me as very much a parallel.
Fear of your actual neighbor, or fear of the guy down in the slums downtown?
No, but also the sense that it's the people who came in through Canada and they were living in our community as normal.
So anti-immigrant fear and that sort of thing.
Exactly, and therefore, in some ways, very similar to what happened in the 1950s. So the 1950s ended up being not in fact a time of great organizing, but in fact a time of enormous repression, because everybody ended up turning on one another out of fear of one another.
No, I see. I don't think there was that much repression in the 50s. I think it was internalized. I mean, if the actual repression associated with, say, McCarthyism, it was not very much. I mean, the people who didn't want to submit to it, I remember very well, just laughed at it. I mean, in fact, at the time of the Army McCarthy hearings, I was a grad student at Harvard, and living at home. So they had one television set on campus for out-of-campus students, and a couple of friends of mine and I would go over in the afternoon and watch the hearings, and we were all cheering for McCarthy. For good reasons. He was being shafted because, although he was a gangster, he ran up against bigger gangsters who were going to destroy him, namely the Army. He was fine as long as he was attacking weak people, but as soon as he went after the Army, he just got crushed. So we were cheering for Joe, and nothing happened to you. You could do whatever you wanted. There was almost no repression. It was powerful because people accepted it. In the 1960s, they tried to redo it, and people just laughed at them, and it collapsed. The House Un-American Activities Committee was still around, and they got people to come and testify, and they just laughed at them, and so it disappeared because they didn't have any force behind them. So yes, there's a lot. That's internal repression, when you accept repression when it barely exists, instead of standing up against it, in which case it can collapse. But fear of the person down the road or something, that's common. So take, say, the neighborhood where I live in near Boston. It's a kind of a professional, upper middle class suburb with a lot of, professors and doctors and that kind of thing. When you, at night, every couple of nights, 3 o'clock in the morning, some horrible alarm goes off, waking up everybody in the neighborhood. Turns out everybody's got an alarm except us. Everyone has an alarm system, and they go off randomly, and they're all linked to the police station, which doesn't ever answer them because they assume they're false alarms, which they always are. But or if it's not an alarm in a house, it's on a car or something. It's the same thing. So, and it's because people are scared. Well, what are they scared of? I mean, the greatest threat in this town is maybe a cattle be lost or something like that. But people are scared, so they have to have alarms and this, that, and the other thing. And yes, they're afraid, and that's fostered. But it's part of something much broader, I think. It's part of the effort to break down solidarity and sympathy. And that shows up in all kinds of ways. Like take privatizing schools. What's the point of privatizing schools? Well, the idea is to instill in people the idea that all you care about is yourself. So I don't happen to have children of school age, so therefore, according to the ideology that's implanted in you, I'm not supposed to care whether the kid down the street has school to go to. So I don't want to pay taxes. I want to cut taxes because I don't care if that kid goes to school. And if, since I have enough money, I could send my kid to private school if I wanted to, so who cares if they're public schools? So we should privatize schools to eliminate the conception that we should care if some other kid goes to school. which everybody has. So you got to drive it out of their heads. The same is true, I don't know if it's happening here, of efforts to privatize pension and security systems. What's the point of that? Like in the U.S., these big effort to try to privatize Social Security. I mean, you know, financially speaking, it's ridiculous. It's a huge cost and everything else. But there are reasons for it. Social Security is based on an unacceptable principle, namely that each person, that you should care if the disabled widow across town survives. And you're not supposed to care about that. You're supposed to care about whether you have enough pairs of shoes and stuff like that, and, you know, enough cars and video games or whatever it is. That's all you're supposed to care about. So you got to privatize Social Security. Also, another advantage to privatizing Social Security is that it has the brilliant consequence of turning working people against their own interests. Because if your pension is tied up in stocks, you want to make sure those stocks go up. And the way those stocks go up is by cutting wages and reducing working conditions and, you know, sending jobs to, you know, Chinese sweatshops and so on. So as a working person, you have to be committed to undermining your own interests. And that's important. So for reasons like that, you want to privatize Social Security and privatize water and schools and everything else, and also make people afraid of each other. So you should be afraid of the people next door. So you should pour your money into alarm systems that the police aren't paying any attention to. It's all idiotic, and so on and so forth. Yeah, these are ways of controlling people. And fear is one of them. That's why fear of crime is so high in the United States. It's not because of crime. It's because it's manufactured.